President Donald Trump's agenda to reform the federal government is running full speed ahead. On Tuesday, his administration sent a memo titled Fork in the Road to federal workers and offered them what many are calling buyouts. Others are calling deferred resignation. So he offered two paths. First, federal workers can just remain in their current position with no guarantee they will keep their jobs, or they could resign. They will receive pay and benefits until September 30th, 2025, regardless of their workload and whether they work from home. The memo outlined 4 essential pillars to reforming the federal workforce. The first pillar is returning to the office 5 days a week, no more working from home. The second is increased performance standards. Third is a downsizing of the majority of federal agencies. And the fourth, ensuring employees follow certain conduct standards. Now, the American Federation of Government Employees responded to the move in a statement, writing in part, quote, "Purging the federal government of dedicated career civil servants will have vast unintended consequences that will cause chaos for the Americans who depend on a functioning federal government." It is clear that the Trump administration's goal is to turn the federal government into a toxic environment where workers cannot stay even if they want to. Now, Blaze TV contributor TJ Moe feels differently. He wrote on X, "Trump offering to buy out all 2 million federal workers with 8-month severance and benefits, such a boss move, will save $100 billion plus and get rid of all the people who aren't working and don't want to be there. Everyone else comes back to the office and gets back to work." Meanwhile, Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, former vice presidential candidate with Kamala Harris, he writes, "Trump sows chaos in federal workforce, then says resign within a week. I'll give you 7-month severance. Don't fall for it. Trump told innumerable contractors he'd pay them. Then he stiffed them. He has no authority to promise severance pay. Wait him out." Bloomberg columnist Matt Iglesias also chimed in, writing, "I know laws don't matter anymore in the Trump kingdom, but is there any statutory authority for offering broad buyouts to federal employees? Did anyone appropriate money for that?" So, all right, let's discuss. Look, I am for downsizing the federal government where appropriate. I'm not for suddenly bringing this all to a screeching halt, I guess, although that does sound kind of appealing. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask federal employees to come back to the office when so many working people in the private sector have had to do just that. Some employees, I believe, can be just as effective working from home. I don't think it's most people. I think most people do benefit from being in an office environment. So is it so unreasonably like, well, if you don't want to do this, be held to the higher standards or the same standards people are held to in the private sector, then look, here's a nice severance. It's a really generous severance package, actually, and go find work elsewhere.
I don't have a problem with asking people to go into the office. But this buyout plan, the White House does not have a piggy bank, Robby. There's no piggy bank in the Oval Office. There's no appropriation of this money. Plus, Senator Kaine is correct. Donald Trump has a pattern, a well-established pattern over decades of stiffing workers. So when Tim Kaine said to people, don't believe it when he said he's going to pay you that money, especially given the fact that there's no statutory basis for this. There's no money appropriated for this. So that's the move. And also, I want to take up something else you said. Well, there are two things I have a problem with. The demonization of federal workers. You know, I keep going back to Steve Bannon saying at the beginning of Trump's first administration, we're here to dismantle the administrative state. You continue to use the word reform, which is what they use. There's a difference between reforming the government and basically dismantling the government. Reform, fine. Dismantling, not fine. And when you talk about shrinking, you know, the issue is not the size of government, the issue is the purpose of government. When you're talking about getting rid of federal workers who take care of health agencies, take care of things that have to do with children learning to read, having to do with taking care of our elderly, having to do with helping people who are hungry, that's what a lot of these federal workers are doing. This is why a lot of the talk about DOGE, for instance, get rid of the fat, absolutely. But what many of us are concerned about is cutting into the bone. And just blanket, you guys get out of here. That's not reform. That's demonization of the federal workforce,
Sure.
Basically a demonization of the U.S. government.
Sure, I feel fine to demonize the U.S. government. I don't want to demonize federal workers. They're people, obviously. I don't.
That's what they
I'm
are.
not,
That's what they
yeah,
are. That's what they are.
I think. Okay, but a lot of Americans feel like, look, it's our tax dollars going to these people's salaries, and we have such a vast federal bureaucracy, including on what you just talked about, health. And yes, I agree with you. Obviously, I want to make healthcare cheaper for Americans, more efficient for Americans. Absolutely. And I think a lot of people would say, we have this massive, complicated bureaucracy, so many people working for the government in this role. I mean, the budget for this is astronomical. Why doesn't that translate to better care and service if we're spending that much money? And then they say, well, is it because there's inefficiencies? Are there administrative redundancies? If we're spending this much money, why doesn't it work better?
If we're spending that much money, why don't we just have Medicare for all? You want to simplify it, Robby? Make it universal health care, just like in every other advanced nation. We don't have great results. We have the highest expenditures and some of the worst results. Medicare for all would take care of all of that.
Would it, though?
Yes, it would. Well, Medicare works. How about Medicare for all?
I mean, the conservative response or concern is that under such a system, then the government has no ability or knowledge to set the price of things. You don't end up knowing what you're paying for. You swamp the medical system. You end up waiting in long lines. You end up having to ration care, right?
Insurance companies are doing that right now.
No, we don't have a good system. I mean, no defender of the current system.
Insurance companies are doing that right now. And when you say waiting in long lines, you think people aren't waiting in long lines right now?
People are waiting in long lines, but the lines are long. I mean, we can debate this, but people will say that the lines are even longer in places that have, for Canada has long lines. People come here for very critical care that they have to wait months and months to get in Canada. If you're rich enough, you come here to get it instead because you can pay for better care if you're willing to pay.
Well, that has to.
And I don't want to change to a system where, well, we're all equal now, but it's all equally SHITTY for everybody. That wouldn't be better.
There are provisions. You know, every country that has socialized medicine has a different system. And Australia does that better, England does that better, France does that better. But there are ways to have private insurance provisions in there that would enable everybody to get
Well, that's what I mean, I want reforms to the system. I want it decoupled. Insurance being tied to your employment doesn't actually make a lot of sense. No. And I absolutely agree that the way it's structured now, both the insurance providers and the providers of the actual medical services, frankly, or the medical the drugs, can charge whatever because you don't pay. You know, somebody is paying for it on the front end. You're paying it back in some later confusing way, but they disguise the price of it because of the system.
We have 1.3 million Americans who are rationing insulin.
Yeah.
The price of insulin is obscene. It is immoral, and it should be free.
Well, but isn't that part of that's part of a licensing scheme? Because I think intellectual property is way too strictly handled by our government, and there's way too much of a boon to pharmaceutical companies because you're not allowed to make generic kinds of drugs. If I think it's the FDA, if they would just ease up on that a little bit, insulin could have competitors, and then you drive down the cost of it without having to have the government say, no, here's exactly what you're allowed to charge for it. I'm not in favor of that. I'm in favor of ending government-created monopolies and having actual competition in these
So then
markets.
You're saying that you would still buy from a private company, it would still be a medical cost, but everybody would be competing for how low
I would say somebody else can say,
insulin.
well, if your insulin is $100 a shot, somebody else say, well, mine's 80, and then somebody else says, well, mine's 60. They can't do that right now because only one company can market it under government order.
So this is where the left and the right come together, is this anti-corporate monopoly conversation. You and I agree on that. Insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies are way too powerful. And there are two different ways we can go about breaking through that and take a hammer to that. We just need to agree on the fact that we need to take a hammer to it. But as long as we have the undue influence of money on our political system, then you have the extraordinary influence of insurance companies, of pharmaceutical companies, big ag, big food, big chemical, gun manufacturers, big oil and defense contractors, which basically are governing this country in a very real way.
Speaking of pharmaceutical companies, we're going to be taking a look at the upcoming confirmation hearings for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., someone who feels very negatively toward them. See if his confirmation is going to go through. Stay tuned. More Rising right after this.